That was when Martha Colton looked up from her mending and saw him, a man walking the road alone. No horse, no wagon, no bedroll slung across his back, just boots dragging through the August dust, like each step cost him something he could not afford to lose. He came from the direction of the mountains, from the high country where nobody lived and nobody went unless they were lost or did not want to be found. Martha's breath caught somewhere between her throat and her chest and stayed there. She sat on the porch of the cabin her father had built with his own two hands, the cabin where she had been born, where her mother had died, where she had married Samuel Colton on a spring morning that now felt like something she had dreamed. The needle in her fingers went still, the torn shirt in her lap forgotten. Every nerve in her body pulled tight like fence wire in winter. She had been mending Samuel's shirts for 3 years now, though there was no one left to wear them. She could not bring herself to throw them away or cut them into rags because they still smelled faintly of him when she pressed them to her face faintly, of soap and sweat and the cedar chips he kept in the bureau drawer, and sometimes on the hardest nights that smell was the only thing that kept the world from feeling entirely empty. So she mended them, patched the elbows, stitched the collars, kept them whole because keeping something whole was easier than keeping herself whole, and at least the shirts held still while she worked on them. A man who walked this far in August heat was either desperate or dangerous, maybe both. Thunder rolled across the land from the west, low and heavy, like God dragging furniture across a stone floor. The sky out there had turned the color of a bruised purple and black and swollen, pressing down on the hills like it meant to crush them flat. Wind came in gusts that smelled of dust and something electric, something that made the hair on her arms stand straight. Martha rose from her chair. One hand found the porch post rough under her palm. The other hand drifted to the doorway where Samuel's Winchester leaned against the frame, its stock worn smooth from years of use. She did not pick it up, not yet, but she knew exactly where it was, the way a woman alone on the frontier always knew where the nearest weapon sat, the way she knew the sound of every board that creaked in the night, the way she knew which shadows were just shadows and which ones moved. The Winchester had no ammunition, had not held a shell since before Samuel died. But it was heavy and it was real, and sometimes the shape of a gun was enough to make a man think twice. She prayed this stranger would not call her bluff. He reached the old gate at the edge of her property, the gate that hung crooked on its leather hinges, the gate she had fought with every single day for nearly 3 years and never had the strength or the skill to fix. He stopped there, did not touch it, did not lean on it, did not reach over to lift the latch. Instead, he took off his hat. Water dripped from the brim, though the rain had not yet started. Sweat, she realized. The man was soaked through with the effort of walking, his shirt dark across the shoulders and chest, clinging to a frame that was broad and solid as a barn beam. His hair was dark and tangled. His beard was thick and unkempt, the kind of beard a man grew when there was no one in his life worth trimming it for. "Ma'am," he said. His voice came out rough as gravel dragged across a creek bed. Deep, quiet, the voice of a man who did not use it often. "Storm's coming hard. Would you mind if I waited it out on your porch? I won't come past the gate without your say." Lightning flashed white across the yard, and in that single frozen moment, Martha saw him clearly. Face weathered like saddle leather left out in the rain and the sun for years on end. Lines carved deep around his eyes, not from laughing, but from squinting into distances most men would never cross. Hands hanging at his sides, big as dinner plates, scarred across the knuckles, scarred across the backs, scarred in ways that told stories she was not sure she wanted to hear. Not young, not old, just a man worn down by something heavier than miles. And there on his left sleeve, a stain darker than sweat, darker than dirt. The deep brownish red that Martha knew too well, the color that had soaked through Samuel's pillow in the last week of his life, the color that never washed clean no matter how hard you scrubbed. Blood. The man was bleeding. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct she owned split in two and pulled in opposite directions. The old rule, every woman on the frontier lived by the rule her mother had whispered and her father had shouted, and the preacher who raised her had written in the margin of his Bible, never turn away a soul in need. And the other rule, the one that kept women alive out here, where the law was 3 days ride away, never trust a man with empty hands. Both truths pulled at her. Both were right, Neither was enough. She looked at his face, at his eyes, which were gray like river stones, steady, patient, holding no threat she could name, but no warmth either. He stood there with his hat in his hands, like he was asking permission to exist in her presence. And she thought about Samuel, about how Samuel had been a good man, about how even good men died and left you alone with a broken gate and a garden going to seed and a rifle that could not fire. Martha pointed at the second chair on the porch. A small wooden stool her father had made for her mother, sturdy and plain, sitting against the cabin wall like it had been waiting for someone. "It's dry under here," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "That's not an invitation, just permission." The man lifted the gate latch slow and careful, like he wanted her to see every movement of his hands, like he understood that a woman alone had every reason to be afraid, and he was not going to give her one more. He stepped through, and then he did something that surprised her. He turned back and tightened the rawhide loop that held the gate shut, fixed it neat, respecting the fence, the boundary, her home. Something inside Martha's chest eased, just a fraction, just enough to let her breathe. He crossed the yard like he was afraid to break something, like the ground under his boots was not dirt, but glass. He reached the porch, climbed the 2 steps without making them groan, and lowered himself onto the stool with a long, slow breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his lungs, like he had been carrying the whole world on his back and had just set it down, even if only for a moment. Then the storm hit. It did not build or creep or ease its way in. It came all at once, a wall of water and wind slamming into the cabin like a fist. The rain hit the tin roof so hard it rattled Martha's teeth. Wind tore across the yard and ripped a fence post clean out of the ground, sending it tumbling end over end into the dark. Lightning cracked so close the air tasted like metal, and the flash left green ghosts swimming in her vision. The cottonwood by the creek bent nearly double, and the sound it made was the sound of a living thing in pain, a groaning, snapping protest that Martha felt in her bones. She had weathered storms alone before, many of them. The first one after Samuel died had been the worst, not because it was the biggest, but because she had lain in bed listening to the wind try to tear the roof off and realized there was no one to help her hold it down. No one to check the shutters, no one to calm the animals. No one to put a hand on her shoulder and say it will pass, it always passes. After that night, she learned to weather storms the way she learned to do everything else. Alone, with her teeth clenched and her hands gripping whatever was nearest, and her heart beating so hard she could hear it over the thunder. But tonight was different. Martha gripped the arms of her rocking chair and held on. The stranger just sat there, eyes closed, hands resting calm on his knees on those scarred knuckles that told their own history. He was not fidgeting, was not searching the porch for things to steal, was not watching her, was not leaning toward the door or the window or the gun he could not know was empty. He just sat still and quiet like a man who had weathered worse storms than this one and knew the only thing to do was wait. For the first time in a very long while, Martha did not feel afraid. She felt something else instead, something she had almost forgotten existed, the strange safety of another person's presence, the way the cabin felt smaller but somehow less empty with someone else breathing the same air. She had not sat on this porch with another living soul since the night before Samuel's fever broke into something that could not be broken, and the memory of that absence had become so familiar it had turned into a kind of furniture, always there, always in the way, never spoken about. She picked up her mending again. The shirt in her lap was one of Samuel's, though there was no one left to wear it. She stitched because stitching was what her hands knew how to do when her mind did not know what to think. The needle moved in and out. The rain roared. The stranger breathed. An hour passed. Maybe 2. The worst of the storm moved off toward the far hills, dragging its thunder behind it like a sulking child. The rain softened from a roar to a steady rhythm, almost gentle, almost kind. Martha looked at the man and saw that he had not moved. His eyes were still closed. His chest rose and fell evenly. For a moment she thought he might be asleep, but then she noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his left hand pressed against his right forearm, pressing hard, pressing like he was trying to hold something in. The blood on his sleeve had spread, fresh, wet, soaking through the fabric in a slow, dark bloom. Martha's needle froze midair. He was hurt worse than she had first thought. And he had sat there for 2 hours without a word, without a sound, without asking for help. Either he was too proud or too stubborn or too used to suffering alone to admit it. She recognized all three. She had been every one of them. She set her mending aside, went into the cabin, came back with a strip of clean linen and a jar of the salve she made from yarrow and tallow, the recipe her mother had taught her before Martha was old enough to understand why a woman needed to know how to treat a wound. She held them out without stepping too close. "For your arm," she said, "I'm not offering to tend it, just giving you the means." He opened his eyes, looked at the linen, at the salve, at her face. Something shifted behind those gray eyes, something she could not read, but that looked, if she had to name it, like gratitude mixed with shame. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. He took the supplies carefully, making sure his fingers did not touch hers. He rolled up his sleeve and Martha saw the wound, a deep gash across his forearm, ragged at the edges, the kind of cut a man got from barbed wire or a slipped knife or a fall onto rock. He dressed it with the efficiency of someone who had patched himself up many times before, wrapping the linen tight, tying it off one-handed with his teeth. He did not wince, did not flinch, did not make a single sound that acknowledged pain. When he was done, he rolled his sleeve back down and looked out at the rain. "Cornbread's on the table inside," Martha heard herself say. She had not planned to say it. The words just came out the way words sometimes did when the heart moved faster than the mind. "And there's coffee. It's weak, but it's hot." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm obliged," he said. She brought it to him on a tin plate because she was not ready to let a stranger into her home, not yet, maybe not ever. He ate slowly, deliberately, like a man who had not seen a real meal in a while but remembered his manners. He did not ask for more. When he finished, he set the plate on the porch rail and said, "That's the best cornbread I've had in longer than I care to say." It was not flattery. There was no charm in his voice, no attempt to win her over. It was just a fact delivered plain, the way a man states the weather or the time. Night came, the rain thinned to drips, stars appeared through breaks in the clouds. Martha brought a blanket from inside an old one, patched and thin but clean. She laid it on the porch rail near his stool without comment. He took it the same way. No words wasted, no debts created. She went to bed that night with the door locked, in a chair wedged under the handle the way she always did. But as she lay on the rope bed, staring at the ceiling, beams listening to the silence where Samuel's breathing used to be, she realized she could hear the stranger's stillness through the wall. Not his sounds, his stillness. The steady presence of him. And for the first time in nearly 3 years, the silence of the cabin did not feel like a punishment. She slept, really slept, deep and dreamless. She woke before dawn with her heart already racing because the porch was quiet. Too quiet. He was gone. Of course he was gone. A drifter, a stranger, a man passing through. What had she expected? She ran through the cabin in her bare feet, checking the shelf where she kept her coins, the drawer where Samuel's pocket watch lived, the peg where her winter coat hung. Everything was there, nothing missing. He had not stolen a single thing. Then she heard the clang of metal outside and she ran to the window, lifted the curtain and froze. The stranger was shirtless in the pale morning light, sweating even in the cool of early dawn. Her entire gate lay flat on the ground, not broken apart, but carefully dismantled, each piece laid out in order. Samuel's old hammer and saw tools she had not touched since the day she wrapped his hands around a Bible and lowered him into red Texas dirt were spread neatly on a square of canvas. Beside them, pieces of fresh wood cut from the fallen oak at the edge of her property, trimmed and shaped with a precision that spoke of skill. He was not stealing. He was not snooping. He was not doing anything Martha had prepared herself to be angry about. He was fixing her gate, the gate she had wrestled with every day for nearly 3 years. The gate that sagged and stuck and groaned and refused to latch. The gate that was one of 100 small failures she lived with because she did not have the strength or the knowledge or the help to fix them, because Samuel was dead and her father was dead, and the whole world had narrowed down to what one woman could manage alone, which was never quite enough. She watched him work. His back was broad and scarred, the muscles moving under sun-darkened skin, with the rhythm of someone who understood tools the way some men understood horses, naturally, completely, with their whole body. He tested each piece before he set it. He measured with his eye and cut true. He worked with a quiet intensity that had nothing to do with showing off and everything to do with doing the thing right. Martha picked up the Winchester and stepped onto the porch. "You got no right using those tools," she said. He did not even look up. He was fitting a new hinge leather cut fresh from a strip he must have found in the barn. "Gate was poorly," he said. "Figured to fix it." "I didn't ask you to fix nothing." "No, ma'am." He tested the strap between his fists, then began cutting. "But debt's a debt. Cornbread don't come free." Her cheeks warmed. He remembered. The meal she had given him, the small kindness that had cost her almost nothing but meant apparently everything to a man who had nothing. He was paying her back in the only way he knew how, with his hands, with his labor, with the sweat running down his back in the cool morning air. She lowered the gun. "Are you hungry?" she asked. "I could eat," he said. She went inside before he could see her smile. The first one in months, small and quick and gone before she even fully felt it, like a bird landing on a branch and flying off again. Inside the cabin, something else stopped her cold. The stove fire was already lit, crackling softly, the iron warm to the touch. The water bucket, the one she hauled from the creek every morning with arms that ached and a back that screamed, was full to the brim. And sitting on the table beside the empty tin plate from last night, a rabbit cleaned and skinned and ready for the pot, laid out on a piece of bark with something close to reverence. Every small thing that made her life easier he had already done. Before she woke, before she asked, before she even knew she needed it. Who was this man? Quiet, polite, built like a mountain. Hands that could break a man in half but touched her tools like they were holy things. A drifter, a wanderer. Someone running from something or someone searching for something. She did not know which. Both seemed true. That question stayed in her mind as she carried a tin cup of weak coffee to the yard. "You got a name?" she asked. He hesitated, just a beat, a pause so small she almost missed it. Then Silas. She nodded. "I'm Martha Colton." He tipped his head, a gesture from another time courtly and careful. "Pleased to make your acquaintance, Miss Colton." He finished the gate by mid-morning, tested it 3 times, swung it open, swung it shut, latched it, unlatched it, latched it again. It hung straight and true level for the first time since Samuel got too sick to work. Then he wiped every one of her tools clean with a rag, set them on the porch like sacred things, and said the words that Martha had been expecting and dreading all morning. "Storm's past. I'll be moving on now." Her heart stumbled. She looked at the gate hanging straight for the first time in years, at the fire he had started, at the water he had hauled, at the rabbit on the table, at all the small, impossible tasks she had carried alone for so long she had forgotten they were heavy. She looked at the stool on the porch where he had sat through the storm, and she thought about what it had felt like to not be alone even for one night, even with a stranger. She did not want him to go. The realization frightened her almost as much as his arrival had. "Wait," she said. Silas paused. "The creek's up." She said it softly, and it was a lie, and they both knew it. The storm had been fierce but fast, and the creek would be fordable by noon. "Crossing ain't safe today." He looked at her, she looked at him. He knew she was lying, she knew he knew. The truth hung between them like smoke from a fire neither of them had set. Still he stayed. And when she offered him meals in exchange for fence work she had not been able to do alone work that had needed doing since before Samuel died, he accepted with a calm nod. "Fair trade," he said. "Not charity, not pity, a partnership." "Partners," Martha repeated. The word sat strange on her tongue, unfamiliar, like a language she had once spoken and forgotten. She had been a daughter, a ward, a wife, a widow. She had never been a partner. She decided she liked the sound of it. Over the next 6 days, the cabin and the land around it began to change. Silas worked from before dawn until the light gave out. He rebuilt the south fence line that had been leaning since a storm took it half down 2 winters back. He cleared the irrigation ditch that Martha had tried to dig out 3 times and failed because the rocks at the bottom were too heavy for her to lift alone. He split enough kindling to last a month and stacked it neat against the cabin wall. He rehung the barn door. He patched the roof where the tin had peeled back. He did each thing the way he had done, the gate thorough and skilled and silent, like a man who spoke with his hands because his mouth had forgotten how. He also did things she did not ask for and did not expect. He reinforced the chicken coop door that foxes had been worrying at for months. He built a shelf inside the cabin for her jars of salve and dried herbs, measuring the space with his eyes and cutting the boards to fit like puzzle pieces. He dug out the root cellar that had been slowly flooding since the spring thaw, lining the walls with flat stones he carried from the creek one by one. And when Martha came out to see what he was doing, he simply said, "Your preserves will last longer if they stay cool and dry." He knew about preserves, he knew about root cellars. He knew about things that a drifter walking down from the mountains should not have known anything about. Martha tended the garden. She cooked meals with the rabbit he had brought and the vegetables from her small patch of ground and the cornmeal she stretched thin because there was never enough. She mended clothes and churned butter and kept the fire going. She did the work she had always done, the work that kept a homestead alive, but now she did it alongside someone else, and the difference was enormous. It was not just the labor, it was the rhythm of it. The way two people working toward the same purpose created a current between them, invisible but real, the way a river creates a current between its banks. She would be kneading dough inside and hear the ring of his hammer outside, and the two sounds would weave together into something that felt for just a moment like music. She would hang laundry on the line and see him walking the fence with wire cutters in his hand, and the sight of another human being doing useful work on her land would fill her with an emotion so unfamiliar, it took her days to name it. It was not gratitude. It was not attraction, though she would not let herself look at that word too closely. It was belonging, the sense that she was not the only person in the world invested in the survival of this small patch of earth, that someone else cared whether the fence held, and the garden grew, and the roof did not leak. They did not speak much, but the silence between them changed. In the first hours, it had been the silence of two strangers watching each other for signs of danger. By the third day, it was the silence of two people who did not need to fill the air with noise to feel comfortable. By the fifth day, it was the silence of a team. He hauled water before she woke. She made coffee while he sharpened tools. He ate at her table without asking for more. She never had to tell him what needed doing. He simply saw it. She also noticed things about him that did not quite fit. He knew the quality of fence wire by touch. He could estimate the value of lumber with a glance. He spoke in sentences that were short and plain, but chose his words the way an educated man chose them, precisely, carefully, each one placed with intention. His handwriting, she saw at once when he scratched measurements on a piece of bark, was neat and controlled the penmanship of someone who had spent years at a desk before he ever picked up a hammer. These details gathered in her mind like clouds on the horizon, not enough to form a storm, but enough to darken the sky. On the fourth morning, she looked out the window and saw him already at the far fence, kneeling in the grass, testing the wire with practiced hands. The sun was barely up. Dew still clung to the world. And it hit her then, sudden and frightening, how quickly she had grown used to the shape of him moving across her land. How the sight of him working out there had become as natural as the sunrise itself. She pulled away from the window, her heart beating too fast. She was 22 years old. She had been married less than a year to a man she barely got to know before God took him away. She had buried him with her own hands because there was no one else to do it. She had learned to be alone, had armored herself with solitude, had built walls inside her chest that were higher and thicker than any fence Silas could build. She remembered a morning early in her marriage when she had woken before Samuel and watched him sleep. The light had been coming through the window in long gold bars, and one of them lay across his face, and she had thought with a certainty that felt like prophecy that this was what happiness looked like. Not a grand thing, not a thing with trumpets or banners, just a bar of light on the face of someone you loved who was still breathing. She had reached out and touched his cheek, and he had smiled without opening his eyes and pulled her closer. And they had lain there in the gold light, and neither of them knew that in 6 months he would be dead, and she would be alone, and the memory of that morning would become the sharpest knife in a drawer full of sharp things. She was not going to let a stranger with scarred hands and gray eyes tear those walls down. Not in 6 days, not in 60, but that evening on the porch after supper, after the dishes were washed and the fire banked and the land settled into the blue quiet of dusk, she found herself talking. She did not plan it. The words just came and pulled out of her by the silence and the dark and the simple fact of another person sitting close enough to hear. My daddy built this cabin, she said quietly. Cut every log by hand. He was the strongest man I ever knew. Hands big as shovels. Used to sing me to sleep with old songs his mama taught him. Celis paused his whittling, a piece of cedar in his lap, his knife moving slow and sure, shaping something she could not yet see. He did not look up, but she felt him listening the way you feel the ground shift before an earthquake, with his whole body. Mama passed when I was 15, she continued. Baby came wrong. Neither of them lived. Daddy lasted another year, but the light went out of him the day we buried her. He worked himself to nothing and was gone before my 16th birthday. The knife stopped. Preacher Fairley took me in. Only man in town willing to take on an orphan girl with calluses on her hands and nothing to her name. He was old and kind and taught me to read from his Bible. He died when I was 19. Left me this land and the cabin and not much else. She drew a breath and let it out. The stars were coming out now, one by one, like lamps being lit in a house she could not see. Then I met Samuel. Married him on a spring morning. Prettiest day I ever saw. We had less than a year together. He got the fever in December, and by February I was digging his grave in frozen ground alone because the nearest neighbor was 2 hours' ride and the ground would not wait. She paused. I thought I would always be alone after that. Silas looked down at the cedar in his hands. The night pressed in around them, warm and heavy. I lost someone too, he said. His voice was low, almost swallowed by the dark. Not to sickness, to lies. Martha watched him carefully. The firelight from inside the cabin caught the angles of his face, the deep lines, the hard jaw, the eyes that held more pain than he would ever willingly show. How does a person get lost to lies, she asked. He was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. Then, trusted the wrong man, cost me everything I had. He said no more, and she did not press. Some wounds did not open easily. Some were not meant to be open at all, only carried. By the 6th evening, the space between their rocking chairs had shrunk. Not much, the width of a hand, maybe less. Neither of them mentioned it, and Martha was not entirely sure either of them had moved on purpose. But the gap was smaller, and the silence was warmer, and the night felt less like a sentence and more like a choice. Silas told a story that evening, about a mule he once found stuck in a mountain creek, refusing to move, stubborn as stone. He sat on the bank for 2 hours in the pouring rain, talking to the mule, reasoning with the mule, begging the mule, while the animal stood in the water up to its belly and stared at him with an expression that clearly said he was the stupidest creature in the territory. Martha laughed. She laughed like she had not laughed in years, a real laugh, full and sudden, bursting out of her like water through a cracked dam. It surprised her. The sound of her own joy was so unfamiliar, it almost frightened her, like hearing a voice in an empty house. It surprised him, too. He looked at her with something in his eyes she had not seen before. Something soft, something almost tender. And then he looked away quickly back to the cedar in his hands, and the moment passed, but it left something behind, a warmth in the air that had nothing to do with the Texas summer. Later that night, after Martha had gone inside and the cabin was dark, she lay awake and thought about that look. She had seen tenderness before. Samuel had been tender in his quiet way, bringing her wildflowers from the creek bank, leaving them in a jar on the table without a word. But Samuel's tenderness had been the tenderness of a husband doing what husbands did. What she had seen in Silas's eyes was different. It was the tenderness of a man surprised by his own feeling, ambushed by it like a trapper who walks into his own snare. She turned on her side and pressed her face into the pillow and told herself to stop thinking about it. She was 22. She was a widow. She had a farm that was trying to die and a bank account that was already dead. She did not have room in her life for whatever had just passed across a stranger's face in the glow of a Texas evening. But the warmth of it stayed with her, stayed like the heat from a stove after the fire goes out, invisible but present, changing the temperature of everything it touched. On the 7th morning, she checked his arm. She did not ask permission, just walked up to him while he was sharpening the saw and said, "Let me see it." He looked at her for a moment, then rolled up his sleeve. The wound was closing clean, the edges pink and healthy, the yarrow salve doing its work. She touched the skin beside the cut, careful not to press, and felt the heat of healing beneath her fingertips. "It's mending well," she said. "You make good salve," he said. My mother taught me. She taught you right. Their eyes met over his outstretched arm, and the moment hung there suspended like a drop of water on the edge of a leaf, trembling between falling and holding on. Martha pulled her hand back, rolled his sleeve down, stepped away. Breakfast will be ready soon, she said, and went inside and did not look back and told herself the trembling in her hands was from the morning cold and nothing else. The next morning she found her mending basket filled with things of his. A torn shirt seam, socks with holes in the heels. He had not asked her to fix them. He had just left them there, the way he left everything, without words, trusting the gesture to speak for itself. She mended them. He split enough kindling for 3 days. Neither spoke about it. They were becoming something like a team, something that had no name and needed none, a partnership built on small acts, repeated daily until they became as natural as breathing. But peace on the frontier never lasted long. On the 8th day, as the sun was setting, golden across the land, and the sky turned the color of honey and the air smelled of sage and cooling earth, a buggy rolled fast toward the gate, black lacquer, fringed top bouncing. Moving too quick for a friendly visit, too quick for anything good. 2 men stepped out, one fat through the middle, face red and sweating, poured into a dark suit that strained at every seam. The other, tall and lean, with eyes like cold steel jaw, sharp enough to cut paper, standing behind the fat man like a shadow with teeth. Both dressed in heavy wool that did not belong in Texas heat, the uniform of men who valued appearance over comfort, authority over sense. Trouble. Real trouble. The kind that wore a smile. Silas stood when they approached. He moved without hurry, but with purpose, as stepping off the porch and placing himself between Martha and the gate. The hammer was still in his hand. He did not raise it, did not need to. His body said everything his mouth did not. To reach her, you come through me first. The fat man smiled. It was the smile of a man who had practiced it in a mirror, warm on the surface and rotten underneath, the smile of someone who had learned long ago that people feared a grin more than a frown, because a frown told you where you stood, but a grin could mean anything. Mrs. Colton, he said. His voice was smooth and sweet and dangerous, like honey poured over a blade. Name's Thornton. Come to speak about your tax situation. Martha felt the ground shift under her feet. Not the earth. Something deeper. Something she had been afraid of without knowing she was afraid, the way an animal senses a predator before it sees one. She stepped to the edge of the porch. She did not reach for the Winchester, though she wanted to. She stood straight and met Thornton's eyes and said, "What tax situation?" And the evening light went cold and the golden sky turned gray, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled again. But this time it was not a storm coming. It was something worse. Thornton stepped onto the porch without being invited. He moved past Martha like she was furniture, like she was part of the railing or the post or the dust on the boards. His boots were polished to a shine that had no business existing in this part of Texas, and they left prints on her porch that felt like claims. The smell of him reached her before he reached the railing cologne and cigars and the sour undertone of a man who sweated through expensive cloth. He was the kind of man who took up more space than his body required, who expanded to fill any room he entered, who breathed louder and stood wider, and spoke with the unconscious assumption that everyone within earshot was listening because everyone always had been. His companion, the tall, lean man with the steel eyes, stayed at the bottom of the steps with his arms folded across his chest and his gaze fixed on Silas the way a dog watches a dog it has not yet decided to fight. Thornton spread papers across her railing, unfolded them one by one, smoothing the creases with fat pink fingers that wore a gold ring on the left hand and a ruby on the right. He laid them out like a card dealer setting up a game he had already won, and Martha stood there watching her own home become a courtroom she had not agreed to enter. "Your land's been reassessed," Thornton said. He did not look at her when he spoke. He looked at the papers, at the land beyond the porch, at the hills and the creek and the garden and the barn, and his eyes moved over all of it with the slow, satisfied hunger of a man surveying a meal. "County sent a new assessor through last month. Property values have gone up considerable. Means your tax obligation has increased accordingly." He tapped a number on the page. His fingernail made a sound against the paper that Martha felt in her teeth. $47, due in 3 weeks. The number hit Martha like a fist to the stomach. $47. She could work from dawn to midnight for a year and not hold that much money in her hand. She had $18 saved, $18 that represented 3 years of selling eggs and mending clothes and going without sugar and coffee and every small comfort that made life on the frontier bearable. $18 hidden in a tin box under a loose floorboard, every coin earned with sweat and hunger, and the stubborn refusal to let this land beat her. $47 might as well have been 47,000. I don't have that, she whispered. The words came out before she could stop them, and she hated herself for saying them, hated the way her voice cracked, hated the way Thornton's smile widened, like a crack spreading across thin ice. Well now, Thornton said. He clasped his hands behind his back and turned to face her for the first time, and his eyes were small and bright and utterly without mercy. Lucky for you, I'm a man who believes in solutions. I'm prepared to offer you $300 cash for this property. Lock, stock, and barrel. House, barn, land, mineral rights, water rights, the whole of it. That's a generous price, Mrs. Colton. More than generous. $300 for the land her father had carved from wilderness with nothing but an axe and his own bleeding hands. For the cabin he had built log by log, fitting each one with a precision that came from love rather than training. For the garden where her mother had grown herbs and tomatoes, and the roses that still bloomed along the south wall every June, stubborn and beautiful and alive despite everything. For the graves on the hill where her parents lay side by side under wooden crosses, she had carved herself because she could not afford stone. For the place where she had married Samuel on a spring morning. For the place where she had buried him in frozen February ground. $300 for her whole life. Martha felt the number press against her like a physical weight. She thought of what $300 could buy. A train ticket east. A room in a boarding house for a year, maybe two if she was careful. A new start in a city where no one knew her name, and no one knew she had once been a woman with land and a husband and a future. $300 was enough to disappear. Enough to become someone else. Enough to let the memories of this place fade into the kind of soft gray blur that makes loss bearable. And for one terrible, shameful moment, she considered it. The moment lasted less than a heartbeat. Then she looked past Thornton, past his sweating face and his gold rings and his papers spread across her railing, and she saw the hill to the east where two wooden crosses stood against the sky. Her parents. The people who had built this place from nothing and died on it and become part of it, their bones in the soil, their love in the walls, their stubborn refusal to quit, bred into the land itself. No, Martha said. This is my home. Thornton's smile did not disappear. It soured, curdling at the edges like milk left in the sun. He leaned against her railing, the one her father had built, and he looked at her with something that was worse than anger. It was patience, the patience of a man who had done this before and knew exactly how it ended. Mrs. Colton, he said, and his voice dropped into something that was almost kind, almost fatherly, which made it worse. Let me be frank with you. You have no income to speak of, no family, no husband, no help of any kind. You're a young woman alone on a piece of land that's falling apart around you, and the taxes are only going to go up. Take the offer. Walk away. Start fresh somewhere civilized. There's no shame in knowing when you're beaten. The word beaten landed on Martha's chest like a stone. Silas stepped forward. He had been standing at the edge of the porch, still as a fence, watching Thornton the way a man watches a snake he has not yet decided to kill. But now he moved one step, and the weight of that single step changed the air on the porch. That's a low price, Silas said. His voice was quiet, but it carried something that Thornton's smooth words did not. Iron. This land's worth $5 an acre at minimum. Good water, creek access, southern exposure for growing. You're offering pennies on the dollar and calling it generous. Thornton turned to look at Silas. Really looked at him for the first time the way a man looks at something he had dismissed as insignificant and suddenly realizes might be something else entirely. His small, bright eyes moved over Silas's face, his hands, his bearing, and something flickered there. Not recognition, not yet, but the beginning of a question. And who might you be? Thornton asked. A hired hand, Silas said. A hired hand who knows land values. Thornton's smile came back, but it was different now. Thinner. Interesting. The tall, lean man at the bottom of the steps folded his arms. Silas did not look at him. Did not need to. Martha could feel the tension between the three men the way she felt lightning before it struck a charge in the air, a pressure that built and waited for something to break. But nothing broke. Thornton gathered his papers with the careful movements of a man who had all the time in the world. He folded them, tucking them into his coat, and tipped his hat to Martha with a courtesy that was more insult than politeness. 3 weeks, Mrs. Colton, $47, or the land goes to auction. He paused at the top of the steps and looked back. I'd think carefully about my offer. Opportunities like this don't come around twice. He descended the steps. The lean man fell in behind him. They climbed into the black buggy, and the driver whipped the horses, and the buggy rolled away down the road in a cloud of dust that hung in the air long after it was gone, like a stain that would not wash clean. Martha stood on the porch and watched it disappear. Her hands were shaking. Her legs felt like water. Every part of her that had stayed strong and straight while Thornton was watching now began to buckle the way a wall holds during the storm and collapses after. Silas came to stand beside her, not too close. Close enough. That ain't about taxes, he said quietly. His eyes followed this dust cloud down the road. Someone wants your land. Specifically your land. Why? Martha's voice was barely a whisper. It's poor land, barely feeds me. The water. Silas looked toward the creek that ran along the eastern edge of her property, the creek that never dried up even in the worst drought, the creek that every rancher and farmer in the valley depended on. Your creek is the only year-round water source in this stretch of the valley. A man who controls that water controls everything around it. Martha stared at him. The truth of it settled into her like a cold stone dropping into still water. She thought of the families who used to live in the valley, the Hargroves who had sold their place last year for almost nothing and moved to a boarding house in town. Old Man Weathers, who had been on his land for 30 years and then one day was simply gone, his cabin standing empty, his cattle sold at auction. The Dunlaps' 3 children and a pregnant wife packed onto a wagon heading east with everything they owned. She had thought they left because the land was hard, because life out here ground people down and spat them out, and only the stubborn or the foolish stayed. Now she understood. They had not left. They had been pushed. How many? She asked. Silas looked at her with something in his eyes that might have been respect. I don't know for certain, but I'd wager Thornton didn't start with you, and he doesn't mean to stop. Martha sank into her rocking chair. The wood creaked under her familiar and old, and she gripped the arms until splinters bit her palms because the pain was something real, something she could hold on to when everything else was sliding away. I've got $18, she whispered. Saved 3 years. I need 47. Silas knelt in front of her, slowly the way a man kneels before something he considers sacred. He took one of her shaking hands in his, and his hand was rough and warm and enormous around hers, and he held it the way you hold something you are afraid of crushing. You ain't alone, he said, and for the first time in a long time, Martha believed it. Not because of the words, but because of the way he said them. Without pity, without performance. Like a fact. Like the sun rises and the creek flows, and you are not alone. That night, Martha did not sleep. She lay on her rope bed and stared at the ceiling beams and watched the moonlight slide across the window in a slow silver arc. Outside, she could hear Silas on the porch not moving, not sleeping, just there, watching the dark like he expected trouble to walk out of it. Everything felt fragile. Her home, her land, her own heart. The ceiling beams her father had cut and placed with his own hands, the walls he had chinked with mud and moss, the floor she had swept 10,000 times. All of it felt thin as paper ready to tear at the first hard touch. She rose, opened the door, stepped into the moonlight. Can't sleep neither, Silas asked without turning. No. She sank into her rocker. The boards creaked softly. A coyote cried somewhere to the west, long and thin and lonely, and the night smelled of dust and cooling sage and the distant ghost of rain. After a long silence, she spoke, not because she wanted to, but because the silence had filled up with everything she had been carrying alone for 3 years, and there was simply no more room. Every corner of this place holds somebody I loved, she said. The garden is Mama's. The porch is Daddy's. The bedroom is where Samuel used to cough all night while I held a cloth to his mouth and pretended I wasn't scared. Her voice cracked, but she did not stop. You know what the worst part is? It ain't the loneliness. It's the way people look at you when you're alone. Church ladies look at me like I'm a stray dog that wandered in. Men in town look at me like I'm something to be pitied or something to be had. Nobody looks at me like I'm a person standing on her own land doing the best she can. She gripped the arms of her chair and stared at the dark hills where her parents lay buried. And now Thornton wants to erase all of it. Every grave, every garden row, every handprint my daddy left in the mortar of that chimney. $300 and it's gonna like none of them ever lived. The tears came. Not the quiet kind she had learned to swallow over the years. These were the tears of a woman who had just been told her whole life had a price tag and it was less than the cost of a good horse. Silas rose from his chair, crossed the space between them, sat on the edge of the porch beside her rocker, close enough that his shoulder almost touched the arm of her chair. He did not speak, did not offer comfort, just sat there the way a mountain sits beside a valley, steady and unmovable and present. His hand found hers and held it, and the warmth of his palm against her fingers was the first human touch she had felt since the day she closed Samuel's eyes and it undid her completely. She told him things she had never told anyone. Not the facts of her losses, she had spoken those the other night on the porch, but the feelings beneath them. The guilt of surviving when everyone she loved had not. The way she sometimes forgot Samuel's voice and hated herself for it. The morning she woke up and for one cruel second thought her mother was in the kitchen making coffee, and then the remembering hit like a fist. The secret fear that maybe the church ladies were right, maybe she was foolish to stay, maybe holding on to this land was just another way of refusing to let go of the dead. Silas listened to all of it without moving. Then in the dark, he gave her more of his own story. Pieces he had held back the other night, the parts that cut deepest. His name was Declan, Silas said. We built a business together from nothing. 15 years. I thought he was the closest thing I had to a brother. He paused. The cedar stick in his hands was still. He didn't just steal the money. He rewrote the ledgers so it looked like I'd been the one stealing. Turned the whole town against me. People I'd known for years crossed the street when they saw me coming. His voice was steady, but his hands were not. Took me 3 years in court to prove the truth. Won every penny back. But you can't win back the years. Can't win back the way people looked at you. Can't win back the part of yourself that used to trust easy and sleep sound. He looked down at his forearm at the bandage Martha had given him that first night. Barbed wire, he said. Up on the ridge, I was cutting through a rancher's fence line to take the short way down the mountain. Wasn't thinking clear. Storm was coming, and I'd been walking 2 days without much to eat. Wire caught me, and I was too stubborn to stop and tend it proper. Martha nodded. It was such a simple explanation for the thing that had frightened her most that first night. No violence, no dark secret, just a tired man, a rusted fence, and the stubbornness she was coming to recognize as his most reliable trait. Martha wiped her eyes. So you were testing me, she said. That night in the storm, coming to my gate with nothing. You wanted to see if I'd be decent to a man who had nothing to offer. Yes, he said, honest. Direct, no excuses. And was it wrong? Yes. His honesty softened the blow the way nothing else could have. Not apologies, not explanations, just the bare admission spoken into the dark between two people who had both been broken by different things and were sitting close enough to hear each other breathe. Days passed after that. The deadline approached like a slow train, and Martha could hear it coming in everything she did. In the way the eggs felt lighter in her basket, in the way the garden seemed smaller, in the way the hills to the east where her parents lay buried seemed to watch her with an expectation she could not meet. Silas stayed, worked the fence, hauled water, sat with her on the porch in the evenings, fixed what she could not fix, listened when she talked, shared stories until the nights felt less empty and the silence between their chairs felt less like distance and more like trust. Then on a Saturday morning, the second buggy arrived, sheriff included. Martha was in her garden when she heard the horses. She was on her knees in the dirt, pulling weeds from around the tomato plants her mother had first put in the ground 15 years ago. Her skirt was tucked into her waistband. Her hands were black with soil. Her hair had come loose from its braid and hung around her face in damp tangles. Sweat ran down her back and collected in the hollow of her spine. It was the worst possible moment to be seen, and she knew it the instant the buggy stopped and the doors opened, and she looked up from the dirt to see Thornton standing at her gate with the sheriff beside him and two other men behind them, all of them in clean pressed clothes and polished boots, looking down at her like she was exactly what she appeared to be. A poor woman in the dirt. The sheriff was a thick man with a drooping mustache and eyes that would not hold still. He kept looking at Thornton, then at Martha, then at his own boots like a boy caught between two masters. He held a paper in his hand, and he held it the way a man holds something he wishes he did not have to deliver. "Mrs. Colton," the sheriff said, "I've got a notice here, tax assessment confirmation. I need your signature acknowledging the debt. And if I don't sign—" The sheriff shifted his weight, looked at Thornton, looked at his boots. "Then I'm authorized to bring you before the county judge. Ma'am, it'd be easier if you just signed." Easier for whom, Martha thought. But she signed. Not because she wanted to, but because refusing would mean being dragged to the courthouse like a criminal, would mean standing before a judge who probably owed Thornton the same favors that Silas's old partner had traded in, would mean losing the one thing she had left, her dignity, in front of people who had already decided she had none. She signed with dirt-stained hands, and the pen shook and the ink blotted, and Thornton watched with that patient smile of his, and Martha felt something inside her chest turn to fire. She looked down at her signature on the paper, at the way her name looked in shaking ink, and she thought of every other time she had signed her name. In the marriage register at the church was Samuel beside her, smelling of soap and promise. On the deed of trust, when the preacher left her this land, her handwriting careful and proud, because she could write and most women her age could not. Those signatures had meant something. They had been declarations of who she was and what she owned and where she stood in the world. This signature was different. This signature was a confession, an admission that she owed a debt she could not pay on land she could not afford to keep, written in the dirt, stained hand of a woman who had been caught on her knees in a garden by men who would never kneel before anything but money. When the buggy left, she stood in the yard and watched it go, and she was shaking so hard the ground seemed to tremble, though it was only her only. Her body vibrating with a rage she had no outlet for, a fury so hot and so helpless, it burned worse than grief. She walked into the cabin, closed the door, went to the basin and scrubbed her hands. The dirt came off. She scrubbed harder. The skin turned pink, then red. She scrubbed until her knuckles were raw, and still she felt dirty, not from the soil but from the signing, from the way they had looked at her, from the way Thornton had said everything with his eyes that his words had only hinted at. "You are nothing. You have nothing. This is already over." Silas knocked softly on the door. "Go away," Martha said. He did not go away. He stood on the other side of the door and spoke through the wood. "You ain't helpless," he said. "You saw me out there." Her voice was bitter as lie. "On my knees in the mud like a stray dog. Thornton saw exactly what I am." "No," Silas said, and there was something in his voice she had not heard before. Heat, conviction, the sound of a man who had seen something true and refused to let it be called a lie. "I saw a woman keeping her land alive with nothing but grit and two bare hands. That ain't weakness, Martha. That's the strongest thing I've ever seen." She could not hear it. Not yet. The shame was too fresh, too raw, too much like the shame she had felt at 15 when the church ladies whispered about the orphan girl in patched dresses, too much like the shame she had felt at 19 when the preacher died and the town looked at her and saw a burden. She opened the door. Her eyes were red but dry. She had used up her tears the night on the porch and would not waste more. "I'm going to sell Mama's wedding ring," she said. The words fell into the space between them like something dropped from a height. Her mother's ring, a thin band of gold with a chip of garnet that caught the light like a drop of blood. The last piece of her mother she had. The last proof that Agnes Whitfield had lived and loved and mattered. Silas's whole body went rigid. "That ain't happening," he said, and his voice was sharp in a way she had never heard, sharp like a blade being drawn. "Not while I'm standing here." "It has to," Martha said. "I need every dollar I can get. You'll still be short, even with the ring." "I know." Her voice dropped to almost nothing. "But at least I'll have tried." Silas turned away. His hands were shaking. His jaw worked like he was chewing on words too big to swallow. He stood there with his back to her and his fists at his sides, and Martha watched something move through him like weather, like a storm building inside a man instead of a sky. I can fix this, he said, if you'll let me. As charity, he turned back. No, as partners, 50-50, equal, always equal. She stared at him for a long time. The light was behind him and his face was in shadow, and she could not read his expression, but she could hear his breathing, and it were rough and unsteady, and he told her that whatever he was offering, it was costing him something to offer it. She nodded once. All right. The next morning, Silas saddled the horse he had borrowed from the livery, the tall, rangy one, and he told Martha he would be back in 3 days. He did not say where he was going. He did not say what he planned to do. He just said 3 days and she would have to trust him, and trust was the hardest thing he could have asked for because trust was exactly what had been beaten out of her by every loss and every leaving and every man who had ever looked at her and seen something less than what she was. She stood at the gate and watched him ride over the hill and disappear. The dust settled behind him. The gate he had fixed swung gently in the morning breeze, and the absence of him hit her with a force she was not prepared for. Physical, real, like someone had pulled the air from her lungs and left a vacuum where his presence had been. Martha did not sit down and wait. This was the thing about Martha Colton that Thornton had not understood, and that Silas perhaps only partly grasped. She was not a woman who waited. She was not a woman who folded. She had buried both her parents before she was old enough to vote. She had married a man and lost him before she learned his middle name. She had dug a grave in frozen ground with a shovel and her bare hands while the wind cut through her like a knife. She had survived 3 years alone on land that wanted to kill her, and she had done it not because she was brave, but because she did not know how to stop. On the first day without Silas, she walked to the Hargrove place. It was empty now, the windows dark, the garden dead, the fence down. But Mrs. Hargrove was living in a boarding house in town, 3 rooms above the hardware store, and Martha found her there. She was a small woman with gray hair and hands that shook and eyes that went hard when Martha said Thornton's name. He came twice, Mrs. Hargrove said, first with papers, then with the sheriff. Said our taxes had tripled, said we owed $200 we didn't have, offered to buy the place for a pittance. When Hargrove refused, the sheriff came back, said they'd take it at auction. We didn't have the money. We didn't have a choice, son. Martha wrote it down, the date, the amount, the names. She wrote it on the back of a feed receipt with a pencil she had borrowed from the general store, and her handwriting was small and precise and furious. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table and read what she had written. It was not much. One woman's testimony scrawled on the back of a receipt. It would not hold up in any court she had ever heard of. But it was a start, and starts were what Martha Colton was good at. She had started a garden from nothing, started a marriage from hope, started a life from grief. She could start a fight from a feed receipt if she had to. On the second day, she found Old Man Weathers. He was living with his daughter's family outside of town, sleeping in a shed behind their cabin, drinking too much and talking to himself. But when Martha sat down beside him and asked about Thornton, his eyes cleared and his voice steadied, and he told her everything. The false assessment, the impossible deadline, the offer that was not an offer but an ultimatum. The sheriff who served papers with the apologetic eyes of a man who knew he was doing wrong but lacked the spine to stop. Same thing, Weathers said. Same exact thing, like he had a recipe for stealing. Martha wrote that down too. On the third day, she visited the Dunlaps, or what was left of them. Mrs. Dunlap had come back to town after her husband died on the trail east, a fever that took him fast and left her with 3 children and no home to return to. She was washing laundry for wages and living in a tent behind the church. She was 26 years old and she looked 50. Her story was the same. Every detail, the assessment, the deadline, the offer, the sheriff. The same script performed on different stages, and Martha realized that what was happening to her was not personal. It was a system, a machine. Thornton was not a man with a grudge. He was a man with a plan, and her land was just the next square on his map. The realization changed something in Martha. Until that moment, she had been fighting for herself, for her land, her memories, her survival. But sitting in a tent behind the church with a woman only 4 years older who had aged decades in months, watching 3 children play in the dirt with the hollow-eyed cheerfulnesses of kids who had learned too young that the ground could be pulled out from under them, Martha felt the fight expand inside her chest. This was not just about her land. This was about every family Thornton had crushed, every widow he had swindled, Every old man he had robbed with a smile and a stack of papers. If she could not stop him, at least she could make sure someone knew what he had done. At least she could write it down, give it a name, drag it out of the shadows where it had been living, and hold it up to the light. She gathered their stories the way a woman gathers kindling, piece by piece, not knowing if the fire she was building would be enough to warm her or big enough to burn down the thing she was fighting. But she gathered them because doing nothing was a kind of death, and Martha Colton was not ready to die. She wrote a letter that night by lamplight to the land office at the state capitol. She did not know if it would reach the right hands. She did not know if anyone would care. She wrote it anyway, laying out the facts in her small, precise handwriting, naming names, listing dates, describing the patterns she had uncovered. She gave the letter to the mail carrier and watched him ride away and felt the way you feel when you throw a stone into a well and listen for the splash and hear nothing. On the morning of the third day, without Silas, she woke before dawn. The cabin was dark and quiet. The stool on the porch was empty. The second rocking chair sat where it always sat, but without Silas in it, the porch looked like a mouth with a missing tooth wrong, in a way that went deeper than the visible gap. She hauled her own water, lit her own fire, made her own coffee, did every task she had done for years before Silas came and would do for years after if it came to that. She was not weaker without him. She had never been weak. But she understood now in the clear, cold light of his absence the difference between being strong enough to survive and being strong enough to live. She had been surviving. With Silas for those few days she had been living. She missed him. Not the way she missed Samuel, which was a grief that sat on her chest like a stone. She missed Silas the way you miss a sound you did not know you were hearing until it stopped. The rhythm of his hammer, the creak of his chair, the low rumble of his voice telling a story about a mule in a creek, the stillness of him sitting close in the dark while she said things she had never said to anyone. She wanted him back, not because she needed saving, because she wanted to sit on that porch with someone who saw her, really saw her, and did not look away. That afternoon she found something in the barn, tucked behind a feed sack, half hidden, a small leather-bound notebook. She almost missed it. She had gone to the barn to check on the chickens, which were restless and noisy the way chickens get when the routine changes, when the person who usually scattered their feed in the morning is not the person they expect. Animals knew. They always knew when someone was missing. She was reaching for the feed sack when her fingers touched leather. Smooth, worn leather, the kind that had been handled often. She pulled it out and opened it, and her breath stopped. Inside were drawings. Careful, detailed, precise drawings done in pencil by a hand that knew exactly what it was doing. A barn larger than the one she had with double doors and a hayloft. An irrigation system that channeled water from the creek to the garden, using a series of small ditches and wooden gates. A cattle pen with proper fencing. A layout of the property with notes in the margins about soil quality and drainage and where to plant windbreak trees. These were not the idle sketches of a drifter. These were plans, professional plans, the kind of drawings a man made when he intended to stay, when he was building something in his mind before he built it with his hands. And the dates in the margins told her something else. He had started these drawings on the third day, before Thornton came, before the taxes, before any of it. He had been planning to build something on her land, not because she needed rescuing, but because he wanted to create something worth staying for. Who was Silas? The question had been growing in her since the first morning she watched him fix her gate. Now it filled her like floodwater, rising past every wall she had built. She closed the notebook, held it against her chest, stood in the barn with dust floating in the light from the open door, and felt something she could not name, something bigger than gratitude and more frightening than hope. The morning of the tax auction arrived the way all terrible days arrive, ordinary and bright and utterly indifferent to the suffering it contained. The sky was clear. The sun was hot. Birds sang in the cottonwood trees along the main street of town like nothing was wrong, like a woman's whole life was not about to be sold on the courthouse steps for $47. Martha, dressed in her black morning dress, the same dress she had worn to bury Samuel, the only dress she owned that did not have patches or stains. It was too hot for black wool, but she wore it anyway because it was the closest thing she had to armor. She braided her hair tight. She pinched color into her cheeks. She put her $18 in the pocket of her dress folded into a handkerchief that had been her mother's, and she walked out of her cabin and did not look back because looking back would break her, and she could not afford to break. Not today. She rode to town on the gentle, dappled horse that Silas had arranged. The road was 3 miles of packed dirt that wound through dry grass and cottonwood groves and crossed the creek at a shallow ford where the water ran clear over smooth stones. She had ridden this road hundreds of times to church, to the general store, to the post office where she checked for letters that never came from relatives who had long since forgotten she existed. But she had never ridden it like this. She had never ridden it as a woman going to watch her own land be sold out from under her. The town was busier than usual. Word of the auction had spread the way. Bad news always spread, in small places, fast and hungry, feeding on itself. Men stood in clusters outside the courthouse, men in suits, men with money, speculators and land dealers, and the kind of men who made their living from other people's losses. They watched Martha ride in, and their eyes held nothing she wanted to see. Some of them looked at her with pity, which was bad enough. Others looked at her with calculation, measuring her desperation the way a butcher measures a carcass, figuring out what they could get from what was left. One man, thin and sharp-faced, leaned over to his companion and said something that made them both laugh, and Martha did not hear the words, but she felt them, the way you feel a stone thrown at your back when you are walking away. Thornton was there. Of course he was there. He stood in the shade of the courthouse awning, with his arms folded and his hat pushed back and that smile on his face, and he watched Martha, the way a wolf watches a lamb that has wandered too far from the flock. Not with hunger exactly, with certainty, the certainty of an outcome already decided. Martha tied her horse and climbed the courthouse steps alone. $18 in her pocket. Not enough. She knew it was not enough. She had always known. But she climbed those steps anyway because this land had her parents' graves on it and her mother's garden in its soil and her father's hands in its walls, and she would not let it go without standing up, even if standing up was all she could do. The clerk set up his table, arranged his papers. The crowd pressed in. Martha stood at the front with her chin raised and her hands clasped and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. "Ladies and gentlemen," the clerk began, adjusting his spectacles, "we are here today for the tax auction of the property belonging to Mrs. Martha Colton, located at the eastern edge of the valley, comprising 160 acres of mixed-use land. The outstanding tax obligation stands at $47. Opening bid will commence at—" "Stop!" The voice came from the back of the crowd, clear, calm, carrying an authority that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with the man behind it. The crowd turned. Martha turned. And the world she knew ended, and a new one, terrifying and beautiful and impossible, began. Silas Blackwood walked through the crowd like a man parting water. But he was not the Silas that Martha knew. The man she had fed cornbread to on a stormy night. The man who had fixed her gate shirtless in the dawn. The man who had sat on her porch with cedar shavings in his lap and told a story about a mule until she laughed for the first time in years. That man was gone. In his place walked someone she had never seen before. He wore a suit, not the kind of suit that Thornton wore, cheap and ill-fitting and meant to impress people who did not know better. This suit was tailored, cut from dark wool that draped across his shoulders like it had been made for the body underneath, because it had. His boots were polished to a mere shine black leather with silver toe caps that caught the sun and threw it back. A watch chain hung from his vest pocket, gold heavy, the kind of chain that cost more than Martha's cabin and everything in it. His hair was trimmed neat, his beard was gone, shaped clean, and beneath it was a jaw that was strong and square and belonged on the face of a man who sat at the head of long tables in rooms where decisions were made about the lives of people who would never be invited inside. He walked the way such men walk. Not with arrogance, but with the quiet certainty of someone who understood that the ground beneath his feet would hold because it had always held, because the world was built to hold men like him. There was no hesitation in his stride, no shuffle, no apology. Every step said the same thing. I belong here. I have always belonged here. And you are going to listen to what I have to say. The crowd parted. They could not help it. Something in the way he moved created space, the way a stone creates ripples, naturally, inevitably, without effort or intention. Men who had been leaning against the courthouse railing straightened. Men who had been whispering went silent. Even the clerk, who had been halfway through his opening statement, closed his mouth and set down his gavel and stared. Silas reached the front of the crowd. He did not look at Martha, not yet. He looked at the clerk, and the clerk looked back at him, and something passed between them that the crowd could feel but could not name. Authority, not the borrowed authority of a badge or a title, but the innate authority of a man who had built empires and torn them down and built them again, the authority of someone who understood power not as a thing you wore, but as a thing you weren't. Martha watched him, and she did not recognize him, and she recognized him completely. The way he held his shoulders, the set of his arm, the steadiness of his hands. Those were the same. Those had always been the same, whether he was fixing a gate in the dawn or standing in a tailored suit before a crowd. The man inside the clothes had not changed. Only the clothes had changed, and the terrible thing, the thing that made Martha's chest ache with a pain she could not name, was realizing that the man she had known on her porch was the real one. And this was the costume, and he had taken off the costume to show her the truth and put it back on to save her. And she did not know whether to thank him or scream. $65, Silas said. He reached into his coat and withdrew a stack of bills, counted and neat, held together with a paper band. He laid them on the clerk's table with the careful precision of a man who understood the weight of money, not its weight in paper, but its weight in what it could do and what it could destroy. 47 for the tax obligation. 18 that Mrs. Colton saved herself. Her debt is settled in full. The auction is void. Silence. The kind of silence that falls after a gunshot when the echo has died and the smoke is still rising and everyone is trying to understand what just happened. Then the murmurs began, low at first like wind through dry grass, then rising, spreading, building into a sound that was half whisper and half roar. Silas Blackwood. The name moved through the crowd like a flame through tinder. Martha heard it repeated by voices she recognized, in voices she did not, spoken with a surprise and confusion and something that sounded very much like fear. Blackwood Cattle Company. The Blackwood from Fort Worth. Josiah Blackwood's boy. The cattle baron. Lord Almighty, that's the cattle baron. Martha stood frozen, not from cold and not from fear, from something she did not have a name, for something that felt like the ground opening up beneath her feet, while the sky opened up above her and she was falling in both directions at once. She looked at Silas, at this stranger in a tailored suit who had the same gray eyes as the man who had sat beside her rocking chair in the dark, and held her hand while she cried, and she tried to make the two images fit together, and they would not. They simply would not. The mountain man, the cattle baron, the drifter who ate cornbread on her porch, the millionaire who had just laid $65 on a clerk's table like it was pocket change, the man who had hauled her water and split her kindling and told her stories about mules while the stars came out, the man who had known the whole time that he could end her suffering with a single word and had chosen silence instead. She felt something crack inside her chest. Not break, crack. The way a frozen lake cracks in spring, the sound traveling across the surface in a long, jagged line, the ice still holding, but the fracture visible, the water beneath dark and cold and moving. Silas turned to Thornton. Thornton had not moved. He stood in the shade of the courthouse awning, with his arms still folded and his hat still pushed back, but his smile was gone. In its place was something Martha had never seen on that fat, florid face. Uncertainty. The expression of a man who has been playing a game he thought he controlled and has just realized there is another player at the table who knows the rules better than he does. "I've spoken to the governor," Silas said. His voice carried across the courthouse yard without effort, clear and cold and precise as a blade laid flat against skin. "And to the state land office, and to 3 attorneys who specialize in property law and tax fraud." The word fraud dropped into the silence like a stone into a well. "I know about the false assessments," Silas continued. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Every ear in that yard was turned toward him, and every mouth was shut. "I know about the bank connections. I know about the county assessor who was hired 6 months ago, and who by remarkable coincidence happens to be your wife's cousin. I know about every widow and every farmer and every old man you've forced off their land in the past 2 years." He reached into his coat again and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. Opened it, read aloud. "The Hargrove property, assessed at triple its previous value in March. Sold to you for $60. Market value in over 800. Thornton's face went red. Not the red of embarrassment, but the deep, dangerous red of a man whose mask has been torn away in public. Old Man Weathers, assessed in June. Taxes raised to a level he could not pay. Property seized and sold at auction. You were the only bidder. Purchase price $42. The land is worth $600. Silas folded the paper and looked at Thornton with eyes that held no heat, no anger, no satisfaction. Only the cold, steady clarity of a man who had been cheated once in his life and had sworn it would never happen to anyone in his presence again. The Dunlaps, the Merritts, the Rawlings family, all the same pattern. Reassessment, impossible deadline, forced sale single bidder. He paused. And all of it built on assessments that were never properly filed, never publicly noticed, and never subject to the legal review required by state law. He looked at the clerk, which means every one of those sales is subject to legal challenge. Every single one. The clerk swallowed hard, looked at his papers, looked at Thornton, looked at Silas. Then he picked up his pen and wrote something on the ledger in front of him, and his hand was shaking. Mrs. Colton's taxes are paid in full, the clerk said. His voice cracked on the word full. The auction is canceled. The crowd erupted, not in cheers. This was not that kind of crowd, but in the buzzing, churning, breathless noise of people who have just watched power change hands and are trying to figure out which side of the new arrangement they stand on. Thornton stepped forward. His face was a mask of controlled fury, the fat cheeks trembling, the small eyes burning, the hands clenched at his sides. He opened his mouth to speak, and Silas cut him off with 6 words delivered in a voice that could have frozen the creek in August. You can fight me in court, but you will not win. And then Silas added, almost as an afterthought, I should also mention that Mrs. Colton has been gathering testimony from the families you dispossessed. Dates, amounts, names. She's already written to the state land office. So even if you had a case against me, which you do not, you would also have to contend with the fact that the people you robbed have finally found each other. Martha felt something move through her at those words. He knew. He knew what she had done while he was gone. He knew about the Hargroves and Weathers and the Dunlaps and the letter to the Capitol. He knew she had not sat on her porch and waited to be saved. He knew she had fought. Thornton looked at Silas, looked at Martha, looked at the crowd that was no longer on his side. His jaw trembled. His hands unclenched and clenched again. For a long moment, Martha thought he might say something, might threaten, might bluster, might try to salvage something from the wreckage of his scheme. But he did not. He turned, walked to his buggy, climbed in, and drove away without a word. The lean man with the steel eyes followed. The dust rose behind them, and the crowd watched them go, and no one said goodbye. Martha stood on the courthouse steps. The sun was hot on her face. The $18 she had saved, the $18 she had carried in her pocket like a talisman, were part of the payment that had just saved her land. Silas had not pushed her money aside, had not paid the full amount himself. He had made sure her dollars were counted, her effort acknowledged, her sacrifice woven into the act of salvation, so that she was not merely rescued, but was a participant in her own deliverance. But when he walked toward her, when he came up the courthouse steps with his hand extended, and his gray eyes soft for the first time since he had entered the yard, Martha stepped back. One step. Small. But the distance it created was vast. You lied to me, she said. The crowd noise faded. The sun dimmed. The whole world contracted to the space between two people standing on wooden steps in a Texas town, and the air in that space was brittle and thin and full of broken things. I didn't lie, Silas said. I just didn't tell you everything. You let me suffer. Martha's voice was quiet, but it cut deeper than anything Thornton had ever said to her. You let me talk about selling Mama's ring. You watched me panic. You watched me cry on that porch like my heart was breaking, and you sat there knowing you could stop it. One word, one single word, and everything would have been different. But you said nothing. Silas stood still. He did not reach for her, did not step closer, did not try to close the gap she had opened. I know, he said. You had more money in your back pocket than Thornton was asking for my whole life, and you let me think I was going to lose everything. Yes. Why? The word hung in the hot air between them, and Martha watched his face and saw something she had not expected. Pain. Real pain. the kind that lives behind the eyes of a man who knows he has done wrong and cannot undo it and has to stand in the wreckage of his choices and own every piece. Because I was broken, Silas said. You know what Declan did to me? You know what it cost. I spent years alone in those mountains because alone was the only place that didn't hurt. And when I came to your gate in that storm, I needed proof. Not hope. Proof that a person could look at a man with nothing and still see a human being worth helping. He paused, his voice dropped lower. I used you to prove something to myself. And that was wrong. It was selfish and it was cruel, and I knew it was cruel even while I was doing it, and I did it anyway because the broken part of me was louder than the decent part. Martha stared at him. The courthouse yard had gone quiet. People were watching, but she did not care. Let them watch. Let them see. She was done performing for audiences. So I was your experiment, she said. At first. He swallowed. His throat worked, and his eyes were bright in a way she had never seen bright, the way eyes get when a man who has not cried in years is fighting not to start. Then you weren't. Then you were the woman who gave a stranger cornbread in a storm, who let me sit on her porch with blood on my sleeve and never asked what I'd done to deserve it, who handed me bandages without being asked, who told me about her daddy and her mama and her husband in the dark because she trusted me and I hadn't been trusted by anyone in years. He paused, took a breath, the kind of breath a man takes before he jumps from a high place into water he cannot see the bottom of. And I stayed, not for the test. The test ended the first night, Martha. The first night when you brought me cornbread on a tin plate because you weren't ready to let me inside, but you couldn't let a man go hungry. That's when I knew. That's when the test was over, and everything after that was just a man trying to find the courage to tell the truth and failing every single day. His voice dropped to almost nothing. I stayed because sitting on that porch with you was the first time in 5 years or I didn't feel alone. And I was terrified that if I told you who I was, you'd look at me different. You'd see the money instead of the man. And the man was the part of me I was just starting to get back. Martha felt tears building behind her eyes, but she would not let them fall. Not here. Not in front of these people. She had cried enough in front of this man, enough for a lifetime, and every tear she had shed now carried the weight of knowing he could have prevented them. I need you to go, she said. The words hit Silas like a physical blow. She saw it in the way his body absorbed them, a slight sway, a tightening of the bone, a dimming of the light in those gray eyes that she had grown against all her intentions to care about. Martha, you paid the debt. My land is safe. We're square. She turned away. I need you to go. He stood there for a moment that lasted years. Then he nodded. Once. A single dip of his chin that contained more grief than most men expressed in a lifetime of words. He looked at her one more time, and his eyes held something she would remember for the rest of her life. Not accusation, not anger, not even sadness exactly. Acceptance. The look of a man who understood the cost of what he had done and was prepared to pay it without protest, the way a man steps into cold water knowing the cold will not kill him, but will hurt enough to make him wish it would. He walked down the courthouse steps through the crowd that parted for him again, though this time with different eyes, and he did not look back. Martha watched him go, and she memorized the shape of his back because she knew that was the last time she would see it, and the knowing was a knife she had put in her own chest. She rode home alone. The cabin was the same. The gate he had fixed swung true on its hinges. The fence line he had rebuilt stood straight and strong. The kindling he had split was stacked against the wall. The stove he had tended was cold now, but the ashes still held his shape, the pattern of a man who built fires the same way every time, careful and deliberate and warm. Martha walked through her home, and every room was full of his absence. The porch had 2 chairs and one was empty. The barn had tools laid out with a precision she would never replicate. The garden had rows he had weeded. The water bucket was dry. She sat in her rocking chair as the sun went down, and she did not rock. She sat still and she stared at the empty chair beside her, and she hated him for lying, and she hated him for leaving, and she hated herself for sending him away, and she could not untangle any of these feelings from any of the others because they were all knotted together in the center of her chest like a fist that would not open. The first day without him, she was angry. Pure, clean, righteous anger that burned hot and felt almost good because anger was easier than the thing underneath it. She picked up the leather notebook she had found in the barn, the one with the drawings, the irrigation plans, the barn designs, the careful notes about her soil and her water and her land, and she threw it into the stove. Watched the leather curl, watched the pages catch. Then she lunged forward and pulled it out before the fire took it, burning her fingers, pressing the smoldering notebook against her chest and breathing hard. She could not burn it. She could not burn the proof that he had meant to stay. The second day was worse. The anger faded and what remained was emptiness. A silence that was different from the silence she had lived with for 3 years. That old silence had been the absence of something she had lost. This new silence was the absence of something she had chosen to give up. It was heavier. It was colder. It sat on the porch in the shape of an empty chair, and it followed her through every room, and it slept in the space between her heartbeats. She hauled her own water, lit her own fire, fed the chickens, weeded the garden, did every task the way she had always done them. She was capable. She had always been capable. But capable and whole were not the same thing, and the difference between them was the width of a rocking chair that no one sat in. She found herself doing things that made no sense. Setting 2 cups on the table for coffee, then putting one back. Glancing toward the barn when she heard a sound, expecting to see a broad back bending over a fence post. Starting to say something out loud and then stopping because the person she wanted to say it to was not there. The habits of companionship she discovered were harder to break than the habits of solitude. Loneliness was a room she knew by heart. She could navigate it in the dark. But this new absence was a room she had not learned yet, full of furniture she kept stumbling into. The third day she opened the notebook again. The pages were scorched at the edges, but the drawings survived. She sat at the kitchen table and studied them by lamplight. The irrigation system was ingenious, simple enough to build with hand tools, effective enough to double her garden's yield. The barn plans were practical and beautiful, and there on the last page a drawing she had not seen before. 2 rocking chairs on a porch, side by side, no gap between them, and beneath the drawing in handwriting that was small and precise and nothing like a drifter's 4 words. Something worth building. Martha closed the notebook, held it against her chest, closed her eyes. On the 4th day, the general store woman, the one everyone simply called Mrs. Ida, came to visit. She brought a jar of preserves and a piece of information. Silas had not left town. He was staying at the boarding house. He had been seen at the telegraph office 3 times sending wires to lawyers in the capital, following up on the cases against Thornton. He was not hiding. He was not running. He was finishing what he had started, not for glory, not for Martha, but because it was the right thing to do. He looks like a man whose dog died, Mrs. Ida said, settling into the chair that was not hers to sit in. Walks around town like a ghost, doesn't eat, doesn't talk, just sends telegrams and stares at the mountains. Martha said nothing. I'm not telling you what to do, Mrs. Ida said, which was of course exactly what she was about to do. But I've been alive long enough to know the difference between a man who hurts you because he doesn't care and a man who hurts you because he's too broken to know better. The first kind you run from. The second kind. She paused, looked at Martha with eyes that had seen 70 years of frontier living and had not gone soft. The second kind you decide about. One way or the other, but you decide with your eyes open. She left the preserves on the table and rode away. Martha opened the jar that evening and ate the preserves with a biscuit she had baked herself, and the sweetness of the fruit mixed with the salt of the biscuit, and the taste was so good and so simple that it made her eyes sting. It had been a long time since anyone had brought her something just to be kind. Silas had brought her labor, had brought her strength and skill, in the steady presence of another beating heart. But Mrs. Ida had brought her preserves, which was different, which was the kindness of a woman who understood that sometimes what you needed was not someone to fix your fence, but someone to sit in your kitchen and tell you the truth. She sat on the porch that evening and thought about deciding. She thought about Silas sitting beside her chair in the dark, about his hand on hers, the first human touch in years, about his voice saying those 3 words with the conviction of a man making a vow, about the cornbread and the gate and the water bucket and the rabbit on the table, about the way he listened, really listened with his whole body, like her words were the most important sound in the world. She thought about the lie, the omission, The days of watching her suffer when he could have ended it. The test he had put her through without her knowledge or consent. The arrogance of it, the cruelty of it, the broken, desperate human stupidity of it. And she thought about something her father had told her once long ago when she was very young, and the world was still simple. He had been mending a fence, she remembered, and she had asked him why he fixed things that kept breaking. Because the fixing is the point, he had said. Anything worth having is going to break. Fences break, roofs break, hearts break. You don't throw them out when they break, you fix them. And the fixed thing is stronger than the new thing ever was because it knows what breaking feels like, and it chose to hold together anyway. On the fifth day, Martha made a decision. She made it at dawn. She was standing at the kitchen window watching the light come up over the hills, the same hills she had watched from the same window every morning for years. And she was holding a cup of coffee in both hands, and the steam was rising from the cup and dissolving in the cold morning air. And she was thinking about gates, about how a gate was just a piece of wood on hinges, how it could swing open or swing shut, how it could keep things out or let things in, how the same gate could be a wall or a door depending on who was standing on which side and what they were willing to risk. She had built gates inside herself for years, gates to keep out pain, gates to keep out hope, gates to keep out the terrifying possibility that someone might see her, really see her, all of her, the strength and the fear and the loneliness and the stubborn refusal to quit and not look away. Silas had walked through every one of those gates without asking permission, the way he had walked through the gate at the edge of her property on a stormy night, carefully, slowly, respecting the fence, but walking through anyway. She did not make the decision because she was lonely, though she was. She did not make it because she was grateful, though that was true as well. She made it because she looked at the empty chair on her porch and the drawings in the scorched notebook and the gate that swung true on its hinges, and she understood something that she had been too angry and too hurt and too proud to see before. Silas had been wrong to test her, wrong to hide, wrong to let her suffer. All of that was true, and she would carry the wound of it for a long time, maybe always. But everything else, every single other thing, the gate, the water, the fence, the fart, the stories in the dark, the hand on hers, the way he stood between her and Thornton with a hammer in his fist, the drawings in the notebook, the 4 words on the last page, all of it was real. All of it was true. And the true things outnumbered the false thing, and the false thing was born not from malice, but from a wound that was older than their meeting, a wound that another man had carved into Silas long before Martha ever handed him cornbread in a storm. She could not forgive the lie, not yet, maybe not for a long time, but she could choose. And choosing was different from forgiving. Choosing was saying, I see what you did, and I see who you are, and I believe the second thing is closer to the truth than the first. Choosing was opening a gate not because the person on the other side deserved it, but because the person doing the opening was tired of standing alone. She had been standing alone for a very long time, since she was 15, really. Since the night her mother stopped breathing and her father stopped singing, and the cabin that had once been full of warmth and noise and the smell of cooking became a place where silence lived like a tenant who refused to leave. She had been strong. She had been brave. She had been every word that people use to describe women who survive things they should not have had to survive. But she was tired of those words. Tired of being strong in ways that required being alone. Tired of being brave in ways that meant no one ever saw her afraid. Silas had seen her afraid, had seen her angry and ashamed and broken and crying on a porch in the moonlight with tears running down her face. He had seen all of it, and he had not looked away. That was worth something. That was worth everything. That was worth opening a gate. He came on the 6th day. She heard the horse before she saw it, the steady clop of hooves on the road. She was sitting on the porch with her mending in her lap, the needle moving through fabric the way it had been moving the first time she ever saw him, and the symmetry of it was not lost on her. The world was a circle, and here she was back at the beginning, but different, changed, scarred in new places but also healed in others. Silas stopped at the gate, her gate, the gate he had rebuilt with his own hands. He dismounted, stood there, did not touch the latch, did not reach over to open it. He took off his hat. He was not wearing the tailored suit. He was wearing the same clothes she had first seen him in, the worn shirt, the scarred boots, the dusty trousers of a man who worked with his hands. But his face was shaved clean now, and without the beard he looked younger and older, at the same time younger in the smoothness of his skin, and older in the lines around his eyes and the weight behind them. He stood at that gate the way he had stood in the storm, patient, still, asking nothing, offering only his presence and his willingness to be turned away. Martha set down her mending, rose from her chair, walked to the edge of the porch. She did not pick up the Winchester, did not even glance at it. She stood in the afternoon light with her hands at her sides, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and the distance between the porch and the gate was 10 yards of packed dirt that held the weight of everything that had passed between them. "I haven't forgiven you," she said. "I know. I might not. Not tomorrow, maybe not for a long time. I know that too. You used me. You let me break when you could have held me together. Yes. And if you ever lie to me again by word or by silence, I will put you out that gate and you will never come back. I understand." She looked at him standing there with his hat in his hands and his heart in his eyes, and she felt the last wall inside her chest, the one she had built when she was 16 and reinforced every year since tremble. Not fall. She was not ready for it to fall, but tremble like a fence in a strong wind, testing whether it would hold or whether it was time to come down. "You can come in," she said. She walked down the porch steps, crossed the yard, reached the gate, put her hand on the latch and opened it. She swung the gate wide, the gate that moved smooth and true because he had fixed it, and she stood aside and let him pass. He walked through, slowly, the way he had walked through the first time, like he was afraid to break something. He stopped beside her, and for a moment they stood together at the open gate, shoulder to shoulder, looking at the cabin and the porch and the mountain stretching out beyond it toward the hills where the grave sat quiet on the ridge. Neither of them moved to close the gate. It stood open behind them, swinging gently in the afternoon breeze, and there was something right about that. Something about leaving it open, about not locking anything down or shutting anything out, about letting the air move through. They walked to the cabin together, side by side, not touching. The distance between them was not the distance of strangers, but the distance of two people who were learning a new way to be near each other, a way that accounted for what had broken and what remained. It was awkward and careful and full of a tenderness that neither of them would have been able to name. On the porch, Martha poured 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one without ceremony. He took it, and they sat in the rocking chairs and drank in silence, and the silence was not empty, and it was not heavy. It was the silence of a beginning. The silence of two people who had said everything that needed saying and were now sitting in the space after words, the space where life actually happened. "Your fence needs tightening on the north end," Silas said after a while. "I know," Martha said. "I noticed it yesterday. I'll get to it in the morning." "We'll get to it in the morning," she corrected. He looked at her. She looked at him. And something in the air between them settled like dust after a long wind, like water after a storm. Not peace exactly, something harder than peace and more honest. An agreement, an understanding, a choice made with eyes wide open and hearts that knew exactly what they were risking. "Partners," she said. 50-50, he answered. Always. In the weeks that followed, Silas returned from Fort Worth with supplies. Lumber and nails and wire and seed and tools and cattle, young heifers with soft eyes and strong legs and plans, so many plans. He told Martha he had sold his ranch, all of it, the house, the cattle, the equipment, the brand. "Why?" she asked. They were standing on the porch in the early morning, coffee in their hands, watching the light spread across the valley. "Because I want to build something better," he said. "With you. Not for you. With you." The word mattered, and they both knew it. The first thing they built together was the irrigation ditch. Silas had drawn it in the notebook, a simple system of channels and wooden gates that would carry water from the creek to the garden without Martha having to haul buckets every morning. They dug it side by side, Martha with a shovel, and Silas with a pickaxe, working in a rhythm that required no words. When they hit rock, he broke it. When they hit clay, she shaped the channel wall smooth with her hands. By the end of the 3rd day, water flowed through the garden for the first time in its history, clear and cold and steady, and Martha stood there watching it and felt something shift inside her that she had not expected. Not gratitude, not relief, pride. The pride of having built something with her own hands that would last longer than she would. The pride of a woman who was no longer just surviving on her land, but improving it. Silas saw her face and said nothing, but he smiled, not the careful, measured expression she had grown used to, but a real smile, wet-eyed and unguarded, and it changed his whole face. Made him look like the man he must have been before Declan Mercer taught him that trust was a weapon other people used against you. They walked the rest of the land together. Silas showed her the drawings from the notebook, the ones she had almost burned, and together they marked where the windbreak trees would go, where the new fence line would run, where the barn would stand, where the irrigation ditches would carry water from the creek to the garden. He asked her opinion on everything. Where do you want the barn? What kind of cattle do you prefer? Which direction should the fence run? Every question, a confirmation that this was her land, her home, her decision. He was not building his vision on her ground. He was building their vision together, each line drawn by two hands. Martha had never been asked these questions before. Not by her father, who had loved her fiercely, but made every decision about the land without consulting anyone. Not by Samuel, who had been kind but quiet, and who ran the homestead the way his father had taught him, with the assumption that a man decided and a woman followed. The experience of being asked, of having her opinion sought and valued and incorporated into plans that would shape the future of this place was so unfamiliar that at first she did not know how to respond. She stood in the grass with the notebook open between them and stared at the drawings and felt a door opening inside her that she had not known existed. The barn should face south, she said finally. Daddy always said a south-facing barn stays warmer in winter. Silas nodded, made a note. South it is. And something in the way he wrote it down, in the careful way he recorded her words, as if they mattered as much as any surveyor's measurement, made Martha understand for the first time what the word partner actually meant. Not someone who helped you carry the load. Someone who asked where you wanted to carry it. They stopped at the graves on the hill. Two wooden crosses weathered by sun and wind and rain, the names carved by Martha's own hand, with the dull knife that was all she had. Amos Whitfield, Agnes Whitfield. The dirt around them was clean. Martha kept the weeds pulled. It was the one piece of groundskeeping she never neglected, no matter how tired she was, no matter how much everything else fell apart. She knelt, touched the dirt, pressed her palm flat against the ground the way she always did when she came here, as if she could feel them through the earth, as if the warmth of her hand could reach them wherever they were. I'm not alone anymore, she whispered. I found someone. He's not like Daddy, and he's not like Samuel. He's rougher, and he's harder, and he made mistakes that hurt me. But he's here, and he's staying, and I think you'd understand, Mama. I think you'd know that sometimes the person who comes to your gate in a storm is the person you've been waiting for, even if you didn't know you were waiting. She paused. The wind moved through the grass on the hill and made a sound like breathing. I'm going to be all right, she said. I'm going to be all right now. Silas stood behind her, head bowed, silent, not intruding on the grief, but present in it, holding space the way a man holds a door open without ceremony, without expectation, simply because it is the right thing to do. They walked back to the cabin as the sun climbed higher and the land warmed and the birds sang in the cottonwoods and the creek ran clear and cold along the eastern edge of the property, the creek that Thornton had wanted the water that had nearly cost Martha everything. On the porch, two rocking chairs sat side by side. The space between them was gone now. They were close enough that a hand resting on one armrest could reach the other without stretching. Close enough that two people sitting in them could talk in whispers. Close enough that they fit together the way they had always been meant to fit, like two halves of a thing that had been separated for a long time and had finally found its way back together. Martha sat. Silas sat. The chairs creaked against the boards in a rhythm that was familiar and new, at the same time the rhythm of a house that had two people in it, the rhythm of a porch that was no longer a place for waiting, but a place for being, for staying, for watching the world go by with someone who chose to stay and watch it with you. The sun rose higher, the shadows shortened, the land spread out before them, vast and golden, and full of the kind of promise that only comes to people who have lost enough to know what having means. A hawk circled in the blue above the hills where the graves stood quiet. The creek caught the light and threw it back in flashes of silver. The garden, green and growing, held the morning dew like 1,000 tiny lamps. Martha reached over and took his hand. Silas turned his palm up, laced his fingers through hers, held tight. His hand was rough and warm and scarred and strong, and it fit around hers like it had been waiting all those years in the mountains, all those years alone, waiting for this hand, this woman, this porch, this moment. "We're going to build something good here," she said. "We are," he answered. And the wind moved across the land like a blessing, carrying the smell of sage and cedar, and the distant sweetness of rain, and the two rocking chairs moved together forward and back like a heartbeat, like a promise, like the steady, patient rhythm of two people who had finally, after everything, learned that the bravest thing in the world was not surviving alone but choosing to stay.